Thank you for joining me as I continue my examination of the book Not God's Type by Holly Ordway. In this video, I will be covering chapters 15 through 17 of the book. But let's get started before we dive into chapter 15 with another interlude between the chapters. This would be interlude number 4. And in this interlude, Ordway tells us about a visit that she made to Durham, England, about a year before she became a Christian. And one of the reasons that she went to Durham was that she had just read a book by N.T. Wright, who was the bishop of Durham at the time. And N.T. Wright is a familiar name to followers of these series that I do, these Atheist Read series, because I reviewed N.T. Wright's book Simply Christian a few years back. Well, Ordway, at least as far as she tells us in this interlude, didn't get to meet N.T. Wright, but she did attend services at Durham Cathedral, and while she was there, she noticed during the liturgy that one of the other places mentioned in the day's prayers was the Diocese of the Rio Grande, which struck her as noteworthy because she had just been confirmed in the church relatively recently by the bishop of the Diocese of the Rio Grande. So following the service, she approached the priest, who was also the dean of the cathedral, and she asked for a blessing. And as he prayed with her, Ordway realized that God was truly everywhere, and that this priest in Durham was just as much her brother in Christ as the people in her home church. And she realized that the line from the Nicene Creed, "I believe in the communion of the saints," which she repeated every Sunday, now had new meaning for her. Once again, in this interlude, the concept of community and acceptance is front and center. Ordway has discussed arguments for the existence of God, but she doesn't seem to have considered them very seriously. And if she had, she probably wouldn't describe the argument from First Cause as airtight and irrefutable, regardless of whether she found it personally convincing, as we discussed in the previous video. The main draw of Christianity for her seems to be that it gives her a feeling of purpose and a place to feel at home, which, as I have said before in this series, is perfectly fine with me. My objection is not the feeling of community that she gets from being a Christian, and my aim is not to discredit or invalidate those feelings or the importance of needing that community. My objection is when people pretend that Christianity is a faith of reason and arguments and evidence when, even by their own telling of it, it is not. And we'll get more into that in these next few chapters here. So let's start with chapter 15, which is titled Between Two Worlds. Now, this is a very short chapter. Actually, all of these chapters that I'm going to cover today are shorter than they have been in the previous couple of videos, so we might finish early today. No promises, but we might finish early today. Actually, just look at the runtime of the video. You'll know. You'll figure it out. You're smart. Anyway, so this is a short chapter that consists almost entirely of excerpts from two emails. One is an email which Ordway wrote to Josh, good old Josh, and the other is Josh's response to that email. And the subject was Ordway's sudden realization that God was real and that she felt his presence. And then she was asking Josh what to do next. Like, now that I've had this awakening and I have this new awareness, what do I do next? So Ordway wrote to Josh, quote, "I think my heart has outpaced my head. It's as if the path sloped sharply downward and I find myself going forward much more quickly than expected, pulled by a felt connection like gravity. This has been pretty scary, but I'm also afraid now that if it isn't true, it will have been a cruel trick to feel something I think is real and have it taken away. I hope that's not the case." And she also says that she's afraid for the fact that it is true, because if it is true, then she doubts her ability to live up to the unattainable standards set by God. Well, it's almost as if those standards are so unfairly high that you could never hope to meet them. So you would never be good enough, and you would never have any other choice but to depend on the benevolence and the mercy of the person who set the standards and imposed them on you in the first place. And that's something that happens in abusive relationships. Just throwing it out there. I'll actually come back to that a bit later. Josh writes back to that email that Holly Ordway sent him, and he reassures her, tells her, hey, you know what, you're doing fine. And he says, I don't want to say too much one way or the other because he doesn't want to push her into becoming a Christian too fast. He describes her as not quite being in the kingdom where he lives, but just sort of wandering the countryside. And he's confident that if she continues to wander the countryside, she'll be convinced by the beautiful scenery that this is the place that she wants to stay. And he says, I hope you do decide to stay. You know, I would like to say to Josh what Jack Warden says to Henry Fonda in 12 Angry Men. You know what the soft sell is? Well, you got it. Believe me. And yes, that will be, as far as I plan, the final time that I compare Josh to Henry Fonda and myself to Jack Warden, for that matter. So, okay, so that's it. That's it for chapter 15. Chapter 15 is just a couple of email excerpts, and that's really it. So let's move on to chapter 16, which is titled Holding On. Ordway writes of how shaken she was following her realization that God existed, that Christianity was true, or at least that it looked like Christianity might be true, because she still hasn't quite converted at this point in her story. She still hasn't begun thinking of herself or identifying herself as a Christian. She compares how she felt then to the fear of heights that she developed as an adult. As a child, she had never been bothered by heights. It was only when she got older that they began to make her feel uncomfortable. Quote, I think the difference between my childhood fearlessness and my adult caution comes from a recognition of what it would mean to fall and the experience that accidents do happen. My old moral sense was childish in that way. I sensed that, yes, it was both possible and desirable to be better than I was, but I didn't know how to relate that recognition to my day-to-day actions. Now, though, I found myself on a moral precipice, with the depths yawning beneath my feet and the heights opening up above me, nothing but thin air between me and the reality of the living God. Instead of being able comfortably to measure up to my own standards, I suddenly saw how utterly I would fall short, how indeed I did fall short, of the standards of the infinitely good God. Moral vertigo. Another very brief chapter here. That's pretty much it. Ordway feeling daunted by her new moral awareness, feeling nervous about falling short of God's infinitely high standards. So, let me take a few minutes to talk about those standards, since the chapter itself is very short and it does raise this issue of having to face up to the infinitely high moral standards of God, because these standards and the way that we are told we relate to them by most Christians are a very, very prime example of why I say I could never be a Christian, even if I believed that the God of the Bible existed. Most versions of Christianity, from the extremely orthodox conservative versions to the more moderate, liberal, modern versions, share this notion that we are all to be judged by God's standards. And since none of us can ever hope to measure up to the standards of the infinite, eternal, all-powerful God, we need to depend on God's goodness and God's mercy. If we affirm that the death of Jesus, who unlike us was perfect, was done for our sake, then God will let our lack of perfection slide because he's just that good of a guy. But herein lies my problem. If God created us, why would he create us in such a way that we would be unable to live up to the moral standard he imposed on us? Why not either create us in such a way that we would be more able to meet his standard, or base his standard on our actual potential rather than his perfection? Setting impossibly high standards doesn't help anyone, least of all the people being judged by those standards. If you're coaching a Little League team, do you factor the age of your players into your assessment of their skills, or do you berate your 11-year-old shortstop because he doesn't measure up to Cal Ripken? Or Ozzie Smith, I guess it depends which one you prefer. I was an Orioles fan, so I'm going to go with Cal Ripken. We don't even need to talk about Little League. Would it make any sense for the manager of a Major League Baseball team to shit-talk his star pitcher who throws a 95-mile-an-hour fastball and has league-leading stats because, hey, Babe Ruth could pitch and hit? You really need to step up your game, star pitcher. It makes no sense to set standards that are completely unrelated to the people that we are judging by the standard, and to demand that they live up to impossibly high standards. If the standards aren't remotely attainable by the people to which they're applied, they are useless. You might as well not even have them. If God is infinitely good, and let's just assume that for the moment. I don't believe that for a second if you read the Bible, but let's just assume that we'll define God as infinitely good, and that is the standard, and he judges our goodness by measuring us against him. That is a useless comparison. We'll never measure up. We'll never even come close. The standard seems to exist for the sole purpose of being unattainable. And that's not only useless, practically speaking, because any comparison between us and the standard is meaningless, it's also unjust. It's not fair. Because what are we told God does when he judges us by his impossibly high standards? He finds us wanting, and unless we accept salvation through Christ, we go to hell forever. And sometimes Christians will say, well, yes, but God lived as Christ and died for our sins, so we wouldn't have to go to hell. So we could attain salvation despite our imperfections. And what they ignore, and hope that we ignore, is that the system from which we need to be saved, the system which was designed so that we couldn't possibly succeed, was also made by God. So God creates us, forces us to play a game we can't possibly win, judges us very harshly when we inevitably lose, and then apparently expects to be complimented for his benevolence because he allows a relative few to exit the game unscathed, provided they follow his very peculiar instructions exactly. As I said earlier, this is an abusive relationship. It's not like an abusive relationship. I'm not comparing the relationship between humans and God to an abusive relationship. I'm saying that's what it is. Christians believe that God, if God is, as Christians believe him to be, if he exists, and that is how he is, then humanity is in an abusive relationship with God. God has all the power. God makes all the rules. He sets the standards with a total disregard for what we need or want or are capable of. And when we fail to live up to those standards, when he breaks us, we have only him to fall back on. It is an abusive relationship. That is the Christian view of the universe. Strip it of its comforting traditions and its poetic rhetoric and its pretensions to transcendence, and what you have is an inescapable, never-ending, abusive relationship where the best-case scenario is that we do a bit of groveling and then are allowed to spend an eternity in the company of our abuser, a fate which we are told repeatedly by the abuser himself or by people who claim to speak for him that it will be bliss. It will be just unimaginable bliss when you get to spend eternity with God, your abuser. I say this over and over again in this series, but it keeps coming up, and I have to keep saying it. Why would anyone want this to be true? Never mind the fact that there is no evidence compelling us to think that it's true. Why would anyone want this to be true? A lot of what Ordway writes about in this book, the feelings of belonging, the community that she found in her church. I get all that. I understand all that. All of that is great. That's very human and very understandable and completely valid, and I don't want to step on that at all. But when it comes to the relationship that is proposed to exist between God and humans, the one-sidedness of it, the unfairness of it, the inescapability of it, the fact that you are being judged by an impossible standard. Why would anyone want that to be true? Why would anyone desire that? The most common answer to that question, by the way, is some variation of, well, that's not what it's like at all. You're just twisting it all around. God isn't like that. He loves us. You've got it all wrong, which is exactly what people in abusive relationships say when they're making excuses for their abuser. And also, it's what people in cults say when they're making excuses for their leader. Moving on to chapter 17, which is titled One Miracle. Ordway writes that at this point in her conversion, she considered herself a theist, but was not yet a Christian. She says it was tempting to go no further, to just remain spiritual but not religious. Nobody was going to force her to move forward at anything other than her own pace, least of all Josh. And yet, quote, Josh was a Christian. His rational faith had led him to believe that a man called Jesus of Nazareth was, in some strange way, the Son of God, the Savior. Could that be true? I conceded that it was at least possible. Everything that I had learned, reasoned out, and experienced was at least compatible with the Christian conception of God. Well, I would quibble with her characterizing her conversion as a process of reasoning out. Maybe that's just how it felt to her, but unless she left out a bunch of stuff when she told us about it, I didn't see very much reasoning out. I saw Josh making some very old, picked-over philosophical arguments, and Ordway basically shrugging and saying, yeah, I reckon that's true. She talks about how Josh's rational faith had led him to Christianity, but if Josh got there the same way Ordway is getting there, it wasn't reason that led to his conclusion, but his personal conviction that his subjective experience meant God must exist and Christianity must be true, despite the lack of substantiating evidence. There was probably a lot of rationalizing going on, but it wasn't evidence and rational arguments that got him or Ordway where they were going, despite their claims to the contrary. I do not see that in this book whatsoever. Josh loaned Ordway a book in defense of miracles, and she soon became persuaded by the arguments in favor of miracles. And one of her rationales was that she already believed in God, so why not believe that God could intervene in the affairs of the universe he created? Makes sense. She was concerned initially that belief in miracles would lead her to a view of the universe that was chaotic, where anything was possible. But Josh painted a more reasonable picture. Causes of events must still be skeptically investigated, he said. It's just that believing in miracles offers another possible cause. Quote, as we discussed the concepts, I saw what he meant. My closed naturalistic system was opening up, not to chaos and superstition as I had feared, but to a more complex, more satisfying system, one that better explained my experiences of the world. In a closed system, it was difficult, in fact impossible, satisfactorily to account for things like the origin of the universe, the validity of moral intuition, free will, even the existence of the mind, or the reliability of human reason. Formerly, I had ignored those questions, or accepted facile and unsatisfying answers, or started to follow the naturalistic explanations to their disturbing and ultimately amoral or immoral ends. Now I was free to step outside the box. Well, let's look at the things Ordway says are impossible to satisfactorily account for in a closed, godless system. The origin of the universe, and that may well be true, and if so, that would make sense. We shouldn't necessarily expect to be able to find a full explanation of the circumstances that led to the creation of the universe if the only place we can look is inside the universe. That's not a weakness of the system, it's just an unavoidable part of it. If you can't look outside the system, and whatever caused the system to exist is out there, then you don't get to know what it is. Sorry. That may just be the circumstances in which we are stuck. The other things Ordway mentions are all much less cosmic in nature. Moral intuition, free will, the existence of the mind, the reliability of reason. How can we have satisfactory explanations of these things without appealing to God as the ultimate, and I might add vague and useless for explanatory purposes, explanation? And here's the thing, the explanations for those things might not be to Ordway's liking. They might not be to my liking. But that doesn't mean that those explanations don't exist or that they aren't valid. It might be that moral intuition is bullshit, that moral intuition is not reliable, that in fact, thinking of moral intuition in terms of reliability just is nonsensical. There may be no objective moral facts of which we can become aware intuitively or otherwise. It might also be that what we experience as free will is an illusion. And while we perceive ourselves as making choices, we actually live in a deterministic universe where that which does happen is the only thing that could have happened, regardless of how free we felt to choose to do otherwise at the time. It could be, and probably is, in fact, that the conscious mind is an emergent property of our brains and nervous system, that it is biochemical in nature, and that while it is a complex marvel of interacting biochemical processes, at bottom, that's all it is. And it could be, and again, most likely is the case, that there is no way to independently verify the reliability of human reason, because our acceptance of any such verification would require the use of our reason, which is the very thing being verified. Then again, that last problem would exist whether God existed or not, because you would still always be back to having to trust your own reason and your own judgment if you were deciding whether something was true or not. So maybe that isn't a very good example for Ordway to cite. The point is, there are satisfactory explanations for those things within a closed, godless system. Those explanations might turn out to be might not turn out to be to Ordway's satisfaction or to my satisfaction, but the universe doesn't owe it to Holly Ordway or to me or to anyone else to operate in ways which we find satisfying or comforting. There may be things about ourselves and about our universe that we just will simply never know. Our science has limits. Our capacity to understand has limits. There are certain philosophical questions that don't have solid, definitive answers. There are uncertainties which we will simply have to accept and live with because there's no getting around them. And I don't see what good it does to simply deny that and to say, oh, well, thank goodness I believe in God, so I can just appeal to that whenever I hit a dead end or come to a conclusion that makes me uncomfortable. That just seems very dishonest to me. Ordway writes of how viewing the universe in a way that allowed for the existence of God and the supernatural made more sense than a godless or naturalistic view. Quote, "The God who made the universe and from whom comes our moral sense cannot be a capricious or arbitrary God. By his very nature, he is order, reason, logos. The natural world contains an infinitude of discoverable patterns and relationships, from the motions of the planets to chemical reactions to the life cycles of animals and plants. We apply our intelligence to the world around us and expect to be able to understand it more fully, and we do. Even our ability to use language and have other people understand us, to write a symbol or make a sound and have a stranger in some other place or time understand our meaning, is a remarkable testament to the rational structure of reality." Well, she definitely hasn't read the Bible yet, right? Because Old Testament God is nothing if not capricious and arbitrary. Ordway's argument that God must be orderly and reasonable because the natural world is comprehensible with patterns we can recognize and understand is fallacious. It's fallacious to argue that God could not be capricious and arbitrary because the universe he supposedly created doesn't appear to be capricious and arbitrary. That is a false analogy. And I think it might also be a composition fallacy or something close to that. And those of you who are much better versed in philosophy than I can feel free to correct me and educate me on that. I would appreciate that. You can't assume that the nature of the creation is the same as the nature of the Creator, is my point. Or you can't assume that you can derive everything about the nature of the Creator by studying the nature of the creation. Just because God is capable of creating a rational and orderly universe, that doesn't mean that God is incapable of behaving in an irrational way. And it certainly doesn't mean that God is incapable of being capricious or arbitrary, particularly if we're talking about the Christian God, the God of the Bible, and we can read descriptions of him behaving in capricious and arbitrary ways in the Bible, which is a book he supposedly inspired people to write. So these are things he wanted us to know about himself. Neither the comprehensibility of the universe nor the human capabilities to comprehend it and communicate with each other require God to exist in order for us to explain them. But Ordway does come, again, to a very good question about miracles, and that is, how do we recognize miracles if they indeed take place? How do we distinguish between a genuine, direct act of God and a natural occurrence that appears as though it might be an act of God? Josh cautioned Ordway against calling an event a miracle simply because it doesn't have an immediately apparent explanation. For instance, certain quantum events don't appear to have explanations. And I think he doesn't refer to them specifically, but I think he may be referring to quantum vacuum fluctuations, where quantum particles appear and disappear, sort of seem to pop in and out of existence without any clear cause. But Josh says that just because these events don't have immediately apparent explanations, that doesn't mean that they're miracles. It just means that we haven't figured out what the explanation is yet. Quote, "Consider," Josh said, "the case of a man walking on water, who was verifying his divinity to followers who would soon go on to proclaim him to the world. In that case, we would have a good reason to think that water walking was supernatural rather than merely mysterious." So why do the miracles of Jesus deserve to be considered supernatural, but quantum events don't deserve to be considered supernatural? Josh kind of glosses over that bit. He says by walking on water, Jesus was verifying his divinity to his followers, but isn't that an assumption? How do we know that's what was going on? How does walking on water or performing any other incredible feat verify divinity anyway? How is that even supposed to work? That needs an explanation. There needs to be some connective tissue between he can walk on water and he's divine, because I don't follow that. Is it because Jesus claimed he was divine? Is that all it takes to make the difference between an incredible but non-miraculous occurrence and a genuine miracle? Hey, I'm the Son of God. Now watch this. And I do something amazing, and that verifies it, that proves it. Neither Ordway nor Josh have explained how to tell the difference between a natural event that appears miraculous and a genuine act of God miracle. The closest they've come is to say, well, when Jesus said he was the Son of God and then did something amazing, that must have been a miracle because he said he was the Son of God and then the miracle verified it. Which would be a circular argument if there was any logical connection between doing something amazing and something you claim about yourself being true. And there isn't. Now, at this point, for the first time in the book, Ordway writes about reading the Bible. We're over halfway through, and she finally starts talking about Jesus and the Gospels and things that she has read in the Bible. She says that she has been reading the Gospels during this period of discussion and conversion. And now that the subject had come to miracles, she noticed how many miracles were described in the Gospels. Quote, "I could have spent a long time trying to come to terms with whether these miracles really happened, except that I saw suddenly that these were side paths, leading to interesting territory, no doubt, but not going where I needed to go. Not now. No more dallying in theism. I was ready to move on, to answer the bigger question. Was Jesus who he said he was? There were many miracles that I could think about, but they all paled into insignificance next to the singular miracle of the resurrection. Had it really happened? Because if it had, then Christianity was true. Not necessarily. This is one of the most common Christian talking points, and I think at this point it's just accepted as valid without explanation. And that's too bad because it doesn't make any sense. Even assuming Jesus did the things he's said to have done in the Gospels, walking on water, resurrections, returning to life, following his own death, I mean, and I'm talking about like he really did those things. They weren't illusions, they weren't hallucinations, they weren't any sort of tricks. Jesus actually performed these incredible feats. Even if he did all of that, that doesn't prove that Jesus was telling the truth when he said he was the Son of God. The two things simply are not necessarily related. I keep saying this, but it just doesn't follow. Jesus said, "I'm the Son of God." And people said, "Yeah, prove it." And Jesus said, "Okay, watch this." And he waved his hand, and they were able to feed 5,000 people with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes. Which would be incredible, which would be amazing, which would defy explanation, which may challenge our assumptions of what is possible, but which would not in any way verify Jesus' claim that he was the Son of God. There is simply no logical connection between those two things. If you make an incredible claim and then you do an incredible thing, that doesn't prove that your incredible claim is true unless it's somehow directly connected to the claim, and there's no other explanation for it. If I told you that I was Superman, and you said, "Prove it," and I lifted a car over my head, or flew into the sky, or asked you to shoot at me, and then you did, and it bounced off my chest, would that prove that I was Superman? I mean, now it would be incredible, it would be amazing, but would that prove that I was Superman? And now suppose you'd never even heard of Superman until I showed up and started telling you that I was him. Or maybe you'd heard of him, but it was like an old legend and you'd only had a vague sense of who he was supposed to be. And then I showed up and I said, "Hey, I'm Superman," and I lifted a car over my head and I said, "See, that proves it, I'm Superman." Does that prove anything besides the fact that I'm really strong, perhaps unaccountably strong? Does that prove anything other than the fact that I can fly or that bullets can bounce off my chest? How does any of that necessarily link up to me being Superman, or to other things that I have said about myself, other incredible claims I have made about my identity being true? Maybe I am Superman. It doesn't prove that I'm not. Maybe I am. Or maybe I'm Captain Marvel. Just doing amazing stuff doesn't verify that I'm telling the truth when I claim to be somebody. So, no, even if the resurrection of Jesus actually took place, and by the way, there's no reason in the world to believe that it did, but even if it did, it doesn't prove that Christianity is true, and it doesn't prove any other claim that Jesus made about himself or anything else. It does not verify anything that Jesus said. This statement that Christians like to make as though it's this perfectly logical argument. If the resurrection is true, then if the resurrection happened, then Christianity is true. That it does not follow. It is not a logical argument. It does not make sense to say that. Unless they can show why Jesus returning from the dead necessitates that he was the Son of God, then even if they can prove the resurrection happened, they can't say for certain that Jesus was the Son of God. And they certainly can't claim that Jesus' resurrection proves that he's the Son of God. They need more evidence. They need more evidence for the proposition that Jesus is the Son of God. And in fact, any evidence would be good, because they don't have any, as far as I have ever seen. And this attempt at a logical argument, well, if we can just prove that the resurrection happened, then that proves that Jesus was the Son of God and Christianity is true. It just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. It is a non sequitur. It is not a logically valid argument. The resurrection happened, therefore Jesus is the Son of God. There's nothing between these two premises. One does not imply the other. You need more evidence. And I have never seen any. I have never seen any. Anyway, that's it for this video. That's it for chapters 15 through 17. In the next video, I will be back to take a look at the next 4 chapters in this book, which would be chapter 18, Body and Soul, Chapter 19, Taking a Dangerous Step. Chapter 20, Founder. And Chapter 21, Crossing the Threshold. That will be for next time. That is it for this time. I want to thank you all for watching. As always, please feel free to comment on this video if you have anything to say about anything that I've had to say, if I got something right, if I got something wrong, if I made a great point, if I made a terrible point. Anything you have to say in response to what I have had to say here will be welcome, and I will read it with great interest. Those of you who appreciate these videos I do, please do like, share the videos, subscribe to this channel if you're not subbed already, and also please, if you are not already, consider helping me to make more videos like these and like all the videos that I do by supporting this channel through Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/Steve Shives to become a patron of this channel for as little as $1 a month. And if you decide to pledge at a level higher than $1 a month, for instance, at $5 a month or $10 a month or $20 a month, if you can afford it and you think I'm worth it, there are added perks that you can collect for your generosity. And the perk, one of the main perks at the $10 level, is that you get access to certain video scripts before the videos actually go up. And one of the series that I am posting scripts for is this An Atheist Reads series. So if you want to get a sneak peek at these videos the day before the video actually goes up, and you want a written document of what I am saying in these videos and the responses I am making to Holly Ordway's arguments, do consider becoming a member of the Patreon campaign at the $10 a month level or higher, because you will get access to the scripts for these videos. That's just one of the little perks that I add to show my appreciation to people who support the Patreon campaign. So thank you all so very much for watching, for supporting the Patreon campaign, for liking and subscribing, and basically just for being the awesome people that you are. I'm so gratified that you find this to be of use. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.